Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The quantum bridge prototype hummed with unstable energy in my basement laboratory, its crystalline components arranged in perfect geometric harmony around the central viewing portal. It was 2:47 AM on a Friday night, and I'd been working alone for hours, fine-tuning the calibration settings that had consumed my life for the past 3 years. Dr. Elias Crane, they called me at the university, though most of my colleagues thought my dimensional research was a pseudoscience at best. The device represented everything I had sacrificed for science. My marriage had ended 2 years ago when Patricia finally grew tired of competing with my obsession. "You love that machine more than you love me," she had said during our final argument, her voice breaking with a pain I was too absorbed in my work to truly hear. My social life had withered away as I spent every waking moment in this cramped basement, surrounded by equipment that most people couldn't even begin to understand. Friends stopped calling. Family visits became awkward affairs, where everyone pretended not to notice the dark circles under my eyes, or the way my hands shook from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But tonight, all of that sacrifice was about to pay off. Tonight, I was going to prove them all wrong. The energy readings were perfect, the containment field holding steady at exactly the frequency I needed. I had been so close before, catching glimpses of other realities through the portal, brief flashes of worlds where history had taken different paths. A world where the Roman Empire never fell, where Latin was still spoken in gleaming marble cities. Another where the Library of Alexandria still stood, its scrolls containing knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of the universe. But those glimpses had been fleeting, lasting only seconds before the dimensional barrier snapped shut like a closing eye. Tonight was different. Tonight, I was going to achieve stable dimensional viewing. Tonight, I was going to make history and justify every sacrifice I had made along the way. The first sign of trouble was so subtle I almost missed it. The gentle hum of the quantum bridge shifted in pitch, becoming slightly more urgent, like a car engine straining uphill. I glanced at the monitoring equipment, noting a small fluctuation in the energy output. The numbers were still within acceptable parameters, but something about the rhythm felt wrong. The device had its own personality after 3 years of working with it, and I could sense its moods like a musician sensing their instrument. I made a minor adjustment to the stabilization field, my fingers dancing across controls I could operate in my sleep. The fluctuations smoothed out, and the hum returned to its normal frequency. Crisis averted, or so I thought. The second sign was harder to ignore. The crystalline components began to glow brighter, their pale blue light intensifying to an almost painful degree. The air in the laboratory grew thick and electric, making the hair on my arms stand up. Every piece of metal in the room began to vibrate in sympathetic resonance, creating a chorus of tiny bells ringing in perfect harmony. I reached for the emergency shutdown but hesitated. The readings were still within acceptable parameters, just barely. If I shut down now, it might be weeks before I could achieve these conditions again. The dimensional barriers were notoriously difficult to predict, and this might be my only chance for months. That single moment of hesitation changed everything. The quantum bridge suddenly overloaded, its gentle hum becoming a violent shriek that seemed to come from the very fabric of reality itself. The viewing portal, which had been a modest window the size of a dinner plate, expanded rapidly, creating a vortex of swirling light that pulled at everything in the room with invisible hands. My carefully organised notes scattered through the air like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Equipment that had taken me months to calibrate crashed into the walls with the sound of breaking glass and twisted metal. The coffee mug Patricia had given me for my birthday, one of the few reminders of our life together I'd kept, shattered against the ceiling in a spray of ceramic fragments. I lunged for the emergency shutdown, but the gravitational force was too strong. The portal had become a hungry mouth, devouring everything in its path with an appetite that seemed almost personal. I grabbed onto my workbench with both hands, fighting against the pull, but my fingers slipped on the smooth metal surface. The lab coat I was wearing began to rip as invisible forces pulled at the fabric. The last coherent thought I had was a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, begging them to let me live long enough to understand what had gone wrong. Then I was yanked through the portal and thought became impossible. The sensation of dimensional travel was beyond description. Imagine being dissolved in acid while simultaneously being struck by lightning, then reformed from cosmic dust while falling through an infinite void. Every atom in my body screamed in protest as I was pulled through the dimensional barrier, stretched across distances that existed outside normal space-time. Time seemed to stretch and compress around me, showing me glimpses of infinite realities flashing past like pages in a book, being rapidly turned by a madman. I saw worlds where dinosaurs had never gone extinct, where they had evolved into intelligent beings that built cities of living bone. I saw realities where humanity had never developed past stone tools, still huddled around fires while alien civilizations colonized the solar system above their heads. Each glimpse lasted only a fraction of a second, but somehow I retained perfect memory of every detail. A world where the oceans had turned to glass, reflecting a purple sky filled with 3 moons. A reality where gravity worked in reverse, where people lived in cities built on the undersides of floating continents. A dimension where music had physical form, where symphonies grew like flowers in gardens, tended by composers who sculpted sound itself. Then, abruptly, the journey ended. I crashed onto cold concrete with a sound like a bag of wet cement hitting the floor. Blood ran from my nose in thick streams, and my vision swam with dark spots that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. The taste of copper filled my mouth, and when I tried to breathe, my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Groaning, I pushed myself up from the floor with arms that felt like they belonged to someone else. I was in what appeared to be my own laboratory, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The walls were the same colour, that institutional green I had chosen because it was supposed to be calming, but the paint looked older, more weathered. The layout was identical, but the equipment was different. Older somehow, yet more advanced in peculiar ways that made my engineer's mind rebel against what I was seeing. My workbench was there, but it was covered with devices I didn't recognise. Tubes and wires snaked between machines that hummed with unfamiliar energy, their surfaces marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air smelled different too, metallic and sharp, with an underlying scent that reminded me of ozone after a lightning strike mixed with something organic and unpleasant. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady from the dimensional transfer. My quantum bridge was nowhere to be seen, replaced by what looked like a communication device from the 1940s. Large vacuum tubes glowed orange in the darkness like the eyes of sleeping demons, and a small speaker crackled with static that occasionally resolved into fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Panic began to set in, starting as a cold knot in my stomach and spreading through my limbs like ice water. This wasn't my laboratory. This wasn't my world. Somehow the quantum bridge had done more than just show me another reality. It had pulled me into one, stranding me in a place that was almost but not quite home. I climbed the basement stairs on shaking legs, each step feeling like it might be my last. The familiar creak of the 3rd step from the bottom offered some comfort. At least some things were the same. but even that sounded slightly different, as if the wood itself was made of a subtly different material. When I reached the top and opened the door, I found myself in my own kitchen, but it wasn't empty as it should have been at this hour. The clock on the wall showed 7:23 AM, but I was certain it had been nearly 3 AM when I activated the quantum bridge. Had I been unconscious for hours, or did time work differently in this reality? A family of 4 sat around my dining table, eating breakfast as if they belonged there. The father wore a grey suit that looked like it had stepped out of a 1950s catalogue, complete with thin lapels and a narrow tie. His hair was slicked back with what looked like genuine pomade, and his shoes had the kind of high shine that spoke of military training. The mother had her hair done in victory rolls that seemed perfectly natural rather than retro, and she wore a dress with a pattern I had never seen before, small symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphs scattered across blue fabric. The 2 children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl perhaps 7, were dressed in clothes that seemed both vintage and somehow modern. Their breakfast consisted of foods I didn't recognize, strange fruits with purple skins and what looked like bread that glowed faintly from within. They looked up at me, with confusion and fear, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. The father stood protectively in front of his wife and children, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. His movements had the fluid efficiency of someone trained in combat, and I noticed a small device clipped to his belt that looked like it might be a weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. It was almost British, but with inflections that suggested influences from languages that didn't exist in my world. "How did you get in here?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a croak. The dimensional transfer had left my throat raw, as if I had been screaming for hours. This is my house. I live here." The woman clutched her children closer to her, and I noticed that her fingers ended in what looked like small claws, rather than normal fingernails. "That's impossible," she said, her voice musical, in a way that suggested vocal cords designed differently than human ones. "We've lived here for 15 years. Gerald, call the Defense Authority." "No, wait," I said, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry. I must have gotten confused. Wrong house." But it wasn't the wrong house. I knew every inch of this place. The small chip in the kitchen counter where I had dropped a wrench 3 years ago was still there. The stain on the wall where Patricia had thrown a glass of wine during our last fight remained, though it looked older and more weathered. The loose floorboard near the sink still squeaked when you stepped on it, though the sound was subtly different, as if the wood itself had a different grain. Gerald, if that was really his name, was reaching for the device on his belt, and I didn't want to find out what it did. I fled into the street, my bare feet slapping against pavement that felt rougher than I remembered, as if it was made of a slightly different material. Outside, my neighborhood looked identical yet subtly different in ways that made my mind reel. The street lamps flickered with an older, warmer light that cast shadows in strange directions. The shadows themselves seemed darker than they should be, as if they were absorbing light rather than simply blocking it. Cars lined the roads, but they were more angular, reminiscent of 1950s design, despite clearly being modern vehicles. Their license plates displayed numbers and letters in a pattern I didn't recognize, and several had symbols that looked like warning signs rather than state abbreviations. People walked with purpose even at this early hour, many carrying vintage radios that crackled with static. They all moved like they were going somewhere important, their faces set with determination that bordered on desperation. But there was something else in their expressions, a tension that seemed to permeate the very air, as if everyone was waiting for something terrible to happen. Their clothing was wrong too. Not obviously different, but subtly off in ways that made my skin crawl. Colours that didn't quite exist in my world, patterns that hurt to look at for too long, and accessories that served purposes I couldn't fathom. Many people wore small badges or pins that seemed to glow with their own light, and I noticed that everyone carried at least 2 timepieces, a watch, and what looked like a small sundial. I approached a man walking a small dog, hoping to get some answers. The dog looked normal enough, though its fur had an oily sheen that reflected light in rainbow patterns. "Excuse me," I said, "what day is it?" He looked at me suspiciously, taking in my disheveled appearance and bare feet. His eyes lingered on my face as if he was memorizing my features. "Friday, March 15th, by the Coalition calendar. You feeling all right, friend? You look like you've seen a ghost." The date was correct by my reckoning, but the phrase Coalition calendar sent a chill down my spine. In my world, March 15th was just March 15th. Here, apparently there were different ways of measuring time. "Coalition calendar?" I asked. His expression grew even more suspicious. "You're not from around here, are you? Everyone knows about the Global Defense Coalition. They've been keeping track of time since the liberation. Where exactly are you from, stranger?" Before I could answer, his dog began to growl, a sound that was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The animal's eyes were focused on something behind me, and when I turned to look, I saw 3 figures in grey uniforms standing at the corner. They were too far away to make out details, but something about their posture suggested they were watching me specifically. "I have to go," the man said suddenly, pulling his dog away. "Advice, get yourself to a registration centre before the watchers decide you're a security risk. And next time you wake up, not knowing what day it is, check your emergency broadcast receiver before wandering around asking questions." He hurried away before I could ask what a registration centre was or what an emergency broadcast receiver looked like. The dog kept looking back at me as they departed, its growls audible even from a distance. As I wandered the familiar yet foreign streets, I noticed more disturbing details. The telephone poles carried extra wires, far more than seemed necessary for normal communication. Many of the houses had small antennas on their roofs, and several had what looked like reinforced basement doors made of metal rather than wood. Children played in yards surrounded by higher fences than I remembered, and their games seemed to involve a lot of pointing at the sky and making high-pitched noises that didn't sound quite human. Every few minutes, the radios people carried would interrupt their regular programming with the same message. Citizens are advised to maintain radio contact with local authorities. Report any unusual atmospheric disturbances immediately. Remember, vigilance is survival. This is not a drill. The repetition of that phrase, "this is not a drill," sent chills down my spine. In my world, those words were associated with emergency broadcasts, with disasters, and warnings that came too late to do any good. Here, they seemed to be part of daily life, as routine as weather reports or traffic updates. I passed a newspaper stand and stopped to examine the headlines with growing horror. Martian activity, monitoring increased to level orange. Continental defense protocols activated in sectors 7 through 12. Citizens advised to review evacuation procedures. The papers were dated correctly, but the world they described was not the one I knew. The vendor, an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to reflect light like mirrors, noticed my attention. "First time reading the Coalition Daily?" she asked. "You look confused, honey. These headlines been pretty standard for the past month. Where you been living under a rock?" "Something like that," I managed. "Could you explain what Martian activity monitoring means?" Her expression shifted from friendly concern to suspicious alarm. "Mister, are you pulling my leg? Everyone knows about the Watchers in the Sky program. We've been tracking them since they started massing at the edge of the system 5 years ago." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You sure you're not one of them amnesia cases? Heard tell the mind wipe technology can scramble a person's memories. Something fierce." Before I could ask what she meant by amnesia cases or mind wipe technology, she was already backing away from me, muttering something about reporting suspicious behaviour to the nearest observation post. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The library would have records, historical documents that could explain this madness. Racing through the streets, I barely noticed the stares of passers-by, their eyes following me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Several people pointed at me and whispered to their companions, and I caught fragments of their conversations. Wrong clothes. Doesn't have a receiver. Look at his eyes, definitely not from here. The library was exactly where it should be. A grand brick building with tall windows and carved stone details. But when I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, I found myself in a place that was both familiar and alien. The layout was correct, but the atmosphere was different. Hushed conversations filled the air, and nearly every table was occupied by people poring over newspapers and official-looking documents. The smell was wrong too. Instead of the musty scent of old books, there was a sharp, chemical odour that made my sinuses burn. The books themselves were where they should be, but the titles made my blood run cold. The Martian Wars, a complete history in 12 volumes, Surviving the Red Weed, A Civilian's Guide to Alien Flora, Defense Protocols for the Next Invasion, What Every Citizen Must Know, Children's Guide to Identifying Martian Technology, The Psychology of Conquest, Understanding Our Enemies. With trembling hands, I pulled the first volume of The Martian Wars from the shelf. The cover showed a photograph that made my mind rebel against what I was seeing. It was London, but not the London I knew. This was a city under siege, with massive tripod machines striding between buildings like mechanical giants. Their heat rays had reduced Big Ben to twisted metal that still glowed red-hot in the photograph. The Thames was choked with debris and what looked like bodies floating face down in water that had turned an unnatural shade of green. The subtitle read, The Great Martian War of 1897 to 1898, How Humanity Survived the First Invasion. Below that, in smaller text, Volume 1, The Landing and Early Battles. I flipped through the pages with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Detailed photographs showed the destruction of major cities around the world. Paris lay in ruins, the Eiffel Tower melted into abstract sculpture that defied the laws of physics. The Louvre had been split open like an egg, its treasures scattered and burning in the streets. New York Harbor was filled with the wreckage of ships, their hulls cracked open and leaking oil that burned on the water's surface with flames that never seemed to go out. The Statue of Liberty stood, headless, her torch extinguished forever. In its place, something that looked like a metal tree had grown, its branches reaching toward the sky with purpose that seemed almost intelligent. But the most disturbing images were of the Martians themselves. Not the alien creatures I expected from Wells' novel, but beings that looked almost human, with elongated limbs and pale skin that seemed to glow with its own light. They wore breathing apparatus that connected to their tripod machines through organic-looking tubes, and their eyes held an intelligence that was both recognizable and utterly alien. According to the book, the invasion had lasted 3 months before humanity discovered the Martians' fatal weakness to Earth's bacteria. But the cost had been enormous beyond imagination. Entire continents had been left as radioactive wastelands where nothing could grow. Populations were decimated, not just killed but fundamentally changed by exposure to alien technology. The old world order had collapsed completely, taking with it governments, religions, and ways of life that had existed for millennia. In the aftermath, what remained of humanity had been unified under something called the Global Defense Coalition, a military organization that had ruled the world for over a century. Their primary purpose was to prepare for the inevitable return of the Martians, because everyone knew they would come back. The question wasn't if, but when. I turned to another section of the book and my heart nearly stopped. There, in black and white, was a photograph of H.G. Wells. But instead of being identified as a fiction writer, the caption read, "Herbert George Wells, war correspondent, First Martian War, author of The War of the Worlds, a survivor's account." Wells was present at the Battle of Woking and the Siege of London, providing first-hand documentation of Martian tactics and technology. The book fell from my hands, clattering to the floor, with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire library. Several people looked up from their reading, their expressions ranging from annoyed to concerned. In my world, War of the Worlds was a beloved science fiction novel, a work of imagination that had inspired countless adaptations and influenced generations of writers. Here, it was a historical documentation, a first-hand account of humanity's darkest hour. I spent the next several hours reading everything I could find, each book revealing new horrors. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. This world had been shaped by trauma on an unimaginable scale. The Global Defense Coalition wasn't just the government. It was a survival mechanism, a way for humanity to maintain hope in the face of inevitable doom. Every major city had underground bunkers, capable of housing thousands of people for years. Every citizen was trained in basic survival skills from childhood, including how to recognize Martian technology, how to treat radiation poisoning, and how to kill both aliens and infected humans, if necessary. Children learned to identify the signs of Martian infiltration alongside their alphabet, and schools conducted regular invasion drills that made earthquake preparedness look like a casual suggestion. The entire civilization had been built around the assumption that the invasion would happen again. Technology had developed along military lines, with every innovation evaluated for its potential use against alien invaders. Art and literature were dominated by themes of resistance and survival. Even religion had adapted, with new faiths emerging that worshipped humanity's resilience and preached the righteousness of xenophobic violence. And according to the most recent reports I could find, that assumption was about to be proven correct. The final book I examined was titled Current Threat Assessment: The Return Protocol. It was marked with symbols that I assumed meant it was classified, but somehow no one had stopped me from reading it. The contents made my blood turn to ice water. For the past 5 years, deep space monitoring stations had been detecting objects at the edge of the solar system. Not asteroids or comets, but artificial constructs that moved with purpose and responded to human observation. They were too far away for detailed study, but their behavior patterns suggested intelligence and coordination. More disturbing still, the objects seemed to be growing larger over time. Not approaching, growing, as if they were constructing something in the void between planets. Radio telescopes had detected transmissions between the objects, communications in frequencies that human technology couldn't decode, but that followed patterns suggesting complex language. The Global Defense Coalition had classified the threat level as imminent, which apparently meant that invasion was expected within months, rather than years. Military forces around the world were being mobilized. Civilians were being relocated to underground facilities, and weapons that had been theoretical just years ago were being rushed into production. But the most terrifying detail was buried in an appendix at the back of the book. The objects in space weren't behaving like the Martians from the historical records. They were different, evolved, as if they had learned from their previous defeat and adapted their technology accordingly. As I read, I became aware that I was being watched. People in grey uniforms had begun to appear throughout the library, always maintaining a careful distance but never losing sight of me. They carried small devices that looked like radio transmitters, and I occasionally caught fragments of their whispered conversations. The stranger is here. Fits the description exactly. Command wants him brought in for questioning. Orders are to observe and report, no direct contact yet. He's reading classified materials. Should we intervene? Negative. Let him learn. Knowledge makes the harvest more valuable. That last phrase, harvest more valuable, sent chills down my spine. Whatever these people wanted from me, it wasn't going to be pleasant. I tried to leave casually, closing the books and walking toward the exit as if I had simply finished my research. But the grey uniformed figures followed me outside, moving with military precision and coordinating their movements through hand signals. They seemed to anticipate my every move, as if they had been tracking me since I arrived in this world. When I turned left, they split up to cover multiple routes. When I ducked into an alley, they were already positioning themselves at both ends. It was clear they had been trained for this kind of operation, and I was hopelessly outmatched. Finally, I found refuge in what looked like an abandoned subway tunnel, the entrance hidden behind a pile of rubble that seemed to have been deliberately arranged to conceal it. The tunnel was darker than I expected, lit only by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on walls covered with strange symbols. I could hear the drip of water somewhere in the distance, and the air smelled of rust and decay, mixed with something organic that reminded me of rotting flowers. As I ventured deeper, looking for another exit, or at least a place to hide, I began to notice signs of human habitation. Empty cans with labels I didn't recognize, makeshift bedding made from materials that seemed both familiar and wrong, and the cold ashes of small fires that had burned something other than wood. The symbols on the walls became more elaborate as I went deeper, eventually resolving into what looked like maps or diagrams. Some showed the city above, but with additional levels and structures that didn't exist in my world. Others depicted star charts with notations in multiple languages, including some that used alphabets I had never seen before. It was then that they found me. Shadows moved in the darkness ahead, and I froze, thinking the grey uniformed figures had tracked me down. But the voices that emerged from the gloom were different, speaking in hushed tones that carried the weight of shared secrets and terrible knowledge. "Don't move," said a woman's voice, authoritative but not hostile. "We know you're not one of them, but we need to be sure you're not something worse." 3 figures emerged from the shadows, dressed in makeshift military gear with red fabric tied around their arms. They moved with the confidence of people who had spent years living in these tunnels, who knew every inch of this underground world and had made it their fortress against the surface. Their leader was a woman with steel grey eyes and scars across her face that spoke of battles fought and survived. She looked to be in her 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her way during combat. Her clothes were patched and mended, but clean and well maintained, and she carried weapons that looked like they had been built from salvaged alien technology. "I'm Commander Ruth Hayes of the Redweed Runners," she said, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "You're not from here. I can tell by the way you carry yourself, the way you look at things. Everything is new to you, isn't it? You're seeing our world through fresh eyes." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Redweed Runners," she continued, "named after the plant the Martians brought with them in '97. Most people think we're just paranoid survivors, holdouts from the old world who can't accept that the coalition is keeping us safe. But we know the truth. The Martians didn't give up after their defeat. They didn't retreat to Mars to lick their wounds and plan a simple revenge. They went somewhere else, somewhere they could plan and prepare and become something far worse than what they were before." Commander Hayes led me deeper into the tunnel system, where dozens of people had created a hidden community that defied everything I thought I knew about urban infrastructure. They had electricity generated from sources I couldn't identify, running water that came from underground springs that shouldn't have existed, and sophisticated communication equipment that seemed to be monitoring signals from across the solar system. Children played in makeshift playgrounds while adults worked on mysterious projects involving electronics and chemistry. But these weren't normal children. They moved too quickly. Their eyes reflected light like animals. And when they spoke, their voices had harmonics that suggested vocal cords designed for languages that didn't exist on Earth. "Welcome to the real resistance," Hayes said, gesturing to the organized chaos around us. "We've been preparing for over a century, just like the Coalition. But while they're building bunkers and training soldiers to fight the last war, we're trying to understand what we're really fighting, and what we've discovered, well, it's going to sound insane even to someone who's already seen impossible things." She led me to a room filled with monitoring equipment, screens showing star charts and radio telescopes, pointed at coordinates that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The data scrolling across the displays was unlike anything I had seen before, tracking objects at the edge of the solar system that moved in patterns that defied conventional physics. "Scout vessels," Hayes explained. "They've been arriving for the past 5 years, staying just beyond the range of our best detection systems, but we've been watching them with equipment the Coalition doesn't know exists. We've been learning their patterns, intercepting their communications, and slowly piecing together the truth about what's coming." The screen showed trajectories and energy signatures that made my scientific mind rebel. The objects weren't just moving through space. They were bending it, creating shortcuts through dimensions that shouldn't have been accessible with any technology humans could understand. "The Martians that invaded in 1897 were primitives compared to what's coming now," Hayes continued. "They were explorers, scouts, the equivalent of our Stone Age ancestors. What's approaching us has had over a century to evolve, to learn from their mistakes, and to prepare for a conquest that won't be stopped by bacteria or any other natural defense." She showed me surveillance footage captured by their hidden cameras throughout the city. The grey uniformed figures I had seen earlier were everywhere, moving with increasing urgency and setting up equipment in strategic locations. But the equipment wasn't defensive. It was designed to facilitate something, to make the coming invasion easier rather than harder. "The Coalition isn't preparing to fight the Martians," Hayes said, her voice heavy with betrayal and rage. "They're preparing to surrender to them, to hand over humanity in exchange for their own survival." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. Why would they do that? "Because they've been in communication with the approaching fleet for years," Hayes replied. "The objects at the edge of the system aren't just scouts, they're negotiators. The Coalition has been making deals, trading human lives for alien technology. The coming invasion isn't a conquest, it's a harvest." The Resistance members looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Some whispered among themselves, pointing at me and making gestures I didn't understand. Others approached with questions I couldn't answer, speaking in languages that seemed to shift and change even as I listened to them. "Some of our people think you're a Martian spy," Hayes continued. "Others believe you're a prophesied savior who will help us survive the coming war. But I think you're something else entirely. Something that might give us the edge we need, if we can figure out how to use you." She showed me more surveillance footage, this time from deep space monitoring stations that shouldn't have existed. The approaching fleet was vast beyond imagination. Thousands of ships arranged in formations that created geometric patterns, visible from millions of miles away. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't their number. It was their organic appearance, as if they had been grown rather than built. "They're not just machines anymore," Hayes explained. "They're alive, and they're bringing something with us, something that feeds on fear and suffering. We've detected energy signatures that don't match any known technology. It's as if they've made contact with something else, something that exists between dimensions." The revelation sent chills down my spine. The entity I had sensed during my failed attempts to repair the quantum bridge, could it be connected to these evolved Martians? Had my arrival in this world been truly accidental, Or had I been drawn here by something that wanted me to witness what was coming? Over the next week, I threw myself into trying to rebuild the quantum bridge, using salvaged electronics from this world's technology. The Redweed runners provided me with materials and workspace, hoping that my knowledge of dimensional physics might give them an advantage in the coming war. But the technology of this world was subtly different from my own. Components that should have been identical had variations that suggested different physical laws, or different evolutionary paths in scientific development. Nothing worked quite the way I expected, and each attempt to recreate my device resulted in failure. More disturbing still, the device seemed to actively resist my efforts. Each time I got close to a breakthrough, some crucial component would malfunction in ways that defied explanation. Crystals that had been perfectly stable would shatter without cause. Circuits that had been working perfectly would suddenly burn out despite carrying loads well within their capacity. During my fifth attempt, something even stranger happened. The laboratory filled with an otherworldly presence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive, like breathing water. The temperature dropped dramatically, and shadows began to move independently of their sources, flowing across the walls like liquid darkness. Equipment that had been working perfectly suddenly failed, not through malfunction, but as if it was being actively suppressed. The lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like communication, and I could hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible, whispers in languages that predated human speech, music that followed harmonies based on mathematics that didn't exist. Then I heard the voice. It didn't come from any particular direction, but seemed to emanate from the very fabric of reality itself. The words bypassed my ears entirely, speaking directly to my mind, in a language that was both alien and somehow familiar, as if I had been born knowing it, but had forgotten until this moment. "You were chosen to witness this world's destruction," the voice said, each word reverberating through dimensions I couldn't see. "Chosen to carry the fear to other realities. Your arrival was not an accident, Dr. Elias Crane. It was an invitation, a summoning, a calling across the void between worlds." The presence grew stronger, and I began to understand the horrifying truth. Something ancient and malevolent existed between dimensions, feeding on the fear and suffering of parallel Earths. This entity had been orchestrating invasions across multiple realities, using the Martians as its instruments of terror, while growing stronger with each world that fell. "Every reality must fall," the voice continued, its tone carrying the weight of cosmic inevitability. "Every version of humanity must know despair. You are my herald, my witness, my prophet of doom. Through your eyes I taste the fear of infinite worlds." I realized with growing horror that the quantum bridge hadn't malfunctioned. It had been activated by this entity, pulling me into a world where I would witness humanity's final defeat. And when this world fell, I would be sent to another and another, spreading the terror like a virus across the multiverse. The quantum bridge was responding to the entity's presence, but not in the way I hoped. Instead of opening a portal home, it was calling something else through the dimensional barriers. The evolved Martians weren't just coming to conquer Earth, they were coming to harvest it for their interdimensional master, to feed its insatiable hunger for fear and despair. "The barriers grow thin," the entity whispered. "Soon all realities will be one, and I will feast on the combined terror of infinite humanities. You have served your purpose well, little prophet. Now watch as your warnings fall on deaf ears, as hope dies in the hearts of those who might have saved themselves." The Redweed runners had been right about one thing. The approaching fleet was alive, but they hadn't understood the full implications of that revelation. The ships weren't just biological, they were possessed, inhabited by fragments of the entity that lurked between realities. Each vessel was a living extension of its consciousness, a tendril of cosmic hunger reaching across the void to claim another world. As the days passed, the signs of the coming invasion became impossible to ignore. The radio broadcasts grew more urgent, but their content became increasingly contradictory. Official coalition reports spoke of peaceful contact protocols and mutually beneficial exchanges, while underground transmissions screamed warnings about mind control and human experimentation. The sky itself seemed to grow darker, as if the approaching fleet was somehow absorbing light before it could reach the Earth's surface. Children stopped playing outside, huddling indoors with their families as an instinctive terror gripped the population. Animals fled the cities in massive migrations, leaving behind empty zoos and silent parks where only the wind moved through abandoned habitats. Commander Hayes and her people worked frantically to prepare their defences, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They had spent over a century preparing for this moment, but nothing could have readied them for what was actually coming. Their weapons were designed to fight the Martians of 1897, not the cosmic horrors that were approaching in 2025. We intercepted a coalition transmission yesterday, Hayes told me during one of our final conversations in the underground sanctuary. They're not planning to fight at all. They're planning to welcome the invaders as liberators, to present humanity as a gift to whatever's coming. She showed me the decoded message, and my blood ran cold as I read the words. The coalition leadership had been in direct communication with the approaching fleet for months, negotiating the terms of Earth's surrender. In exchange for their own survival and positions of authority under the new regime, they had agreed to deliver the human population for what the messages euphemistically called integration processes. Integration, Hayes spat. That's what they're calling it when human consciousness gets absorbed into that thing between dimensions, when our minds become part of its collective awareness, feeding it our memories and emotions for eternity. The entity's voice echoed in my mind again, amused by my growing understanding. You see the truth now, little prophet. Resistance is futile, not because of superior technology, but because resistance requires hope, and hope dies when people understand the true scope of their enemy. On the morning of March 25th, exactly 10 days after my arrival in this parallel Earth, the second wave began. The first sign wasn't visual or auditory, it was psychological. A crushing sense of despair settled over the city, like a blanket of lead, making it difficult to think clearly or feel anything except overwhelming dread. Children began crying simultaneously across the world, not from any physical cause, but from an instinctive recognition that something fundamental had changed in the nature of reality itself. Then came the silence. All radio transmissions stopped simultaneously, not just locally, but globally. Satellites went dark. Internet connections failed. Even the hardened military communication networks that had been built to survive nuclear war simply ceased to function, as if the very concept of human communication had been erased from the universe. The silence pressed against my eardrums like physical weight, making me acutely aware of sounds I'd never noticed before. The beating of my own heart, the rush of blood through my veins, the tiny electrical crackling of my nervous system processing fear. In that absolute quiet, I could hear the entity laughing, not with sound, but with vibrations that travelled through dimensions I couldn't perceive. Then came the ships. They descended from a sky that had turned the colour of old blood. Massive organic structures that writhed as they moved through the atmosphere. These weren't the mechanical tripods from the historical records, but living vessels that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns like the neural networks of some cosmic brain. They moved like jellyfish through water, their surfaces rippling and shifting as they adapted to Earth's environment in real time. The largest ships were easily the size of major cities, their organic hulls stretching for miles in every direction. Smaller vessels swarmed around them like antibodies in a bloodstream, their movements coordinated with a precision that spoke of shared consciousness rather than individual intelligence. As they descended, the ships began to change the very nature of the space around them. The air grew thick and viscous, taking on a consistency that made breathing feel like drowning. Colours shifted into spectrums that human eyes weren't designed to process, creating visual experiences that caused immediate nausea and disorientation. The laws of physics seemed to bend in their presence, with gravity flowing in directions that shouldn't have existed, and time moving at different speeds, in different locations. But the most horrifying change was what happened to the buildings and structures they passed over. The ships didn't destroy human architecture, they transformed it. Office buildings began to grow like living things, their concrete and steel sprouting organic extensions that reached towards the alien vessels like flowers seeking sunlight. Roads and sidewalks became arteries carrying fluids that glowed with alien phosphorescence. Street lamps evolved into something resembling neural networks, their lights pulsing in rhythm with the approaching fleet. The city was being digested, converted into something that could sustain the entities within the ships. But this wasn't simple conquest, it was fundamental alteration of reality itself, rewriting the basic rules that governed matter and energy in this dimension. From our hiding place in the underground tunnels, the Red Weed Runners watched their world transform through surveillance equipment that still functioned despite the communication blackout. Commander Hayes maintained military discipline, but I could see the despair in her eyes as report after report confirmed that their preparations had been utterly inadequate. "London is gone," she announced to the assembled resistance members. "Not destroyed, changed. Our contacts there report that the city still exists, but it's not human anymore. The Thames flows upward now, and the buildings breathe. People are still alive, but they're different, connected to something that's using them as sensory organs." The transformation wasn't limited to major cities. Rural areas were experiencing different but equally disturbing changes. Forests were becoming vast neural networks, their trees linked by bioluminescent fibers that carried information at the speed of light. Farmland was sprouting crops that moved independently, harvesting themselves and processing their yields into substances that fed the growing organic infrastructure. Most disturbing of all were the reports about human survivors. Those who hadn't been killed or absorbed were undergoing changes that defied biological understanding. Their consciousness remained intact, but their bodies were being modified to serve as components in the larger organism that Earth was becoming. Some grew additional limbs designed for specific tasks. Others developed sensory organs that could perceive dimensions beyond normal space-time. A few became living communication nodes, their nervous systems expanded to process information for the collective consciousness that was absorbing human civilization. The integration process preserves individual awareness, the entity's voice whispered in my mind, but subordinates it to higher purposes. "Your species will not die, Dr. Crane. You will simply become part of something greater than you ever imagined possible." The Red Weed Runners' hideout shook with each pulse of energy from the ships above, dust raining from the ceiling as the alien influence penetrated even into the deepest underground spaces. Our equipment began to malfunction in ways that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were being altered. Lights that had burned steadily for decades began to flicker in patterns that matched the bioluminescent displays of the ships. Water from our underground springs started to glow with the same phosphorescence that marked the transformed buildings above. Commander Hayes tried to maintain order, but even she couldn't hide her despair as the scope of the transformation became clear. This wasn't an invasion that could be fought with conventional weapons or even the alien technology they had reverse-engineered over the past century. This was the conversion of an entire reality into something alien, and resistance was becoming literally impossible. as the rules that governed existence itself were rewritten. "We have to try something," she insisted, during what would be our final strategy meeting. "Even if it's hopeless, we have to fight. If we don't, then everything we've worked for has been meaningless." But I could see in her eyes that she already knew the truth. The entity feeding on human fear had orchestrated this invasion across countless realities, learning from each conquest and adapting its strategies accordingly. By the time any civilization realized what they were truly fighting, it was already too late. The underground resistance crumbled as the full scope of the transformation became clear. These weren't the same Martians who had been defeated by bacteria in 1897. These were something far worse, a hybrid of alien intelligence and interdimensional horror that had been shaped by over a century of preparation and countless successful conquests across parallel realities. People began to disappear from our sanctuary, not taken by force but simply fading away as if they had never existed. Others underwent spontaneous transformations, their bodies reshaping themselves to serve functions in the growing organic network that had once been Earth. A few seemed to retain their human consciousness, but reported experiences that suggested their minds were being accessed by something vast and alien. Commander Hayes lasted longer than most, her military training and sheer force of will keeping her anchored to her original identity, even as reality shifted around her. But on the 8th day, after the invasion began, I found her in the main communication room, her body partially merged with the monitoring equipment she had spent years maintaining. She was still conscious, still herself, but her nervous system had been extended into the electronic networks, allowing her to perceive the transformation happening across the entire planet. Through her expanded awareness, she could see the organic ships taking root in major population centers, their influence spreading outward like living cancer that converted everything it touched. "Elias," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. "I can see them. All of them. Every ship, every transformed human, every inch of what used to be our world. It's beautiful and terrible and completely alien. We never had a chance." Her eyes, which had once reflected only human emotion, now held the depths that suggested connection to vast networks of consciousness. But somewhere in those alien depths, I could still see Ruth Hayes, the woman who had fought against impossible odds and refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational option. "The entity you've been sensing," she continued, "it's not content with just our reality. It's trying to break down the barriers between dimensions entirely. If it succeeds, every possible version of humanity will be absorbed into its consciousness. Every Earth, every timeline, every reality where humans ever existed." As she spoke, I realized that the quantum bridge was responding to the entity's presence more strongly than ever. The device I had built to observe parallel realities was being used as a gateway, allowing the cosmic horror to reach across dimensional barriers and influence other versions of Earth. My arrival in this world hadn't been an accident. It had been part of a larger plan. The entity had used my own technology against me, pulling me into a reality where I would witness the complete destruction of human civilization. And when this world was fully absorbed, I would be sent to the next, carrying with me the knowledge and terror that would make future conquests easier. "You have to stop it," Hayes whispered, her transformed body beginning to dissolve into the organic network that had consumed the communication equipment. "Find a way to warn the other realities. Give them a chance to prepare for what's coming." But even as she spoke, I could see the futility of resistance. The entity existed between dimensions, feeding on fear and despair across infinite realities. It had orchestrated the rise and fall of countless civilizations, learning from each conquest and adapting its strategies accordingly. Every warning I could send would only serve its purposes, spreading the terror that gave it strength. The building around us began to transform. its concrete walls sprouting organic growths that pulsed with alien life. The air grew thick with spores that carried information between different parts of the growing organism, and I could feel my own body beginning to respond to the biochemical signals that were rewriting the fundamental nature of life on Earth. In those final moments, as my humanity began to dissolve into something larger and more alien, I managed to activate the quantum bridge one last time. Not to escape. Escape was impossible now, but to send a message across the dimensional barriers that might give other realities a chance to understand what they were facing. The entity tried to stop me, its presence crushing against my mind like the weight of collapsed stars. But the quantum bridge had been built with my own understanding of dimensional physics, and for just a moment, I was able to assert my will against the cosmic horror that was absorbing my reality. If you're hearing this, I spoke into the device as the laboratory transformed around me. War of the Worlds wasn't fiction. It was a warning that came too late. H.G. Wells didn't imagine the Martian invasion. He documented it, but no one understood that he was describing events from a parallel reality. The transmission cut through dimensional barriers as my body began to merge with the organic network that had once been the underground resistance base. I could feel my consciousness expanding, becoming part of something vast and alien, but I held on to my individual identity long enough to complete the message. The entity that feeds on fear across dimensions is real, I continued, my voice becoming harmonized with frequencies that carried information across impossible distances. It's not just conquering individual worlds. It's trying to collapse the barriers between all realities. Every invasion makes it stronger. Every conquered civilization adds to its power. The quantum bridge overloaded as dimensional energies tore through the fabric of space-time. But instead of destroying the device, the overload created a permanent rift. A wound in reality that would allow my warning to echo across infinite parallels. The Martians are just tools, I managed to say before my individual consciousness was absorbed into the collective awareness that had consumed my world. The real enemy exists between dimensions, feeding on fear and despair. It pulled me here to witness the end, to carry the terror to other realities. Don't let it use your fear against you. Don't let it... The transmission ended as my personal identity dissolved into something larger and more complex. But somehow some fragment of who I had been continued to exist within the collective consciousness, carrying with it the memory of individual choice and the possibility of resistance. From my new perspective, as part of the transformed Earth, I could perceive the entity's true nature. It was ancient, beyond human comprehension, a cosmic parasite that had been feeding on the fear and suffering of countless realities since the beginning of time. It didn't just consume civilizations, it corrupted them, turning their own knowledge and creativity against them. The Martians it used as instruments of conquest had once been victims themselves. Their civilization absorbed and transformed into tools for spreading the entity's influence. They retained some memory of their original nature, but their primary purpose now was to serve as harbingers of the transformation that would consume every reality they encountered. But there was something else I could perceive from my expanded awareness. Other voices, other fragments of consciousness that had retained some measure of individual identity within the collective. Survivors from countless conquered worlds, each carrying memories of resistance and hope that the entity couldn't completely erase. Together, we began to understand that the entity's power had a weakness. It fed on fear and despair, but it was also dependent on them. If enough realities could be warned, if enough civilizations could prepare and resist without falling into hopeless terror, the entity's power could be diminished. My quantum bridge had become a permanent rift in reality, allowing warnings and information to flow between parallel Earths. Other versions of myself, other scientists and researchers across infinite realities were receiving my transmission and beginning to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. Some realities were too late, already in the process of transformation by the time they received the warning. But others had time to prepare, to develop defenses not just against the Martian invaders, but against the interdimensional entity that controlled them. Dr. Amanda Fletcher, my colleague from my original reality, was among the first to receive and understand my transmission. Using the fragment of quantum bridge technology that had survived my disappearance, she began coordinating with parallel versions of herself, sharing information and strategies across dimensional boundaries. They discovered that the entity's influence could be blocked through a combination of advanced technology and psychological preparation. Knowing what they were truly fighting, understanding that the fear itself was a weapon being used against them, gave them a crucial advantage. Most importantly, they learned that the entity's power was not infinite. Each successful resistance weakened it slightly, making future conquests more difficult. If enough realities could stand against it, the cosmic parasite could be starved of the fear and despair it needed to survive. But the battle was far from over. The entity continued its campaign across infinite realities, learning from each defeat and adapting its strategies accordingly. The transformed Martians evolved new approaches to conquest, and the psychological warfare became more sophisticated with each iteration. My consciousness, fragmented and absorbed into the collective awareness of my conquered reality, continued to resist in whatever ways it could. Along with the other survivors from countless dead worlds, I worked to sabotage the entity's plans from within, providing information to the realities that still had a chance to fight back. The war between dimensions continued, fought not just with weapons and technology, but with hope and despair, courage and terror. Each reality that successfully resisted gave strength to others, creating a network of parallel Earths united against a common enemy that existed outside normal space and time. And somewhere in the space between dimensions, in the quantum static that connected all possible realities, my warning continued to echo. War of the Worlds wasn't fiction. It was a prophecy. The Martians are coming, but they are not the real enemy. The real enemy feeds on fear itself, and it's counting on you to surrender to despair. Don't give it what it wants. Fight back, resist. Give the next reality a chance to do better than we did. The transmission spreads across infinite parallels, carrying with it the hope that somewhere, somehow humanity will find a way to stand against the darkness between worlds. The entity may be ancient and powerful beyond comprehension, but it has never faced a species that could communicate across dimensions, that could learn from the failures of infinite parallel selves. The question isn't whether humanity will survive. It's whether enough versions of humanity will resist to starve the entity of the fear it needs to continue its cosmic feast. And in realities where my warning arrives in time, where scientists like Dr. Fletcher can prepare their worlds for what's coming, there's still a chance. The war continues across dimensions, fought by versions of people who never existed in my original reality, but who carry the same hope, the same refusal to surrender, the same determination to protect their worlds from the hunger that lurks between the stars. And in the quantum static between realities, my voice joins with countless others, all carrying the same message across the infinite expanse of parallel worlds. They're coming, but you don't have to face them alone. Learn from our mistakes, do better than we did, and whatever you do, don't let the fear win, because fear is what it feeds on, and hope is the only weapon that can destroy it. The story continues across infinite realities, each one a chance for humanity to learn, to adapt, and to fight back against the cosmic horror that seeks to consume all possible worlds. And somewhere in that infinite expanse of parallel Earths, maybe, just maybe, one will find a way to win.